My name is Matthew Robinson, and I'm here with Dr. Phillip Andrew Davis and with Dr. Daniel Lanzinger to talk a bit today about the project, What Does Theology Do? And to talk about the symposium, What Does Theology Do to Exegeting Exegesis, which the three of us are organizing and will be hosting next summer, July 9th and 10th, 2021. I research and teach here in the Protestant faculty at the University of Bonn and in the fields of systematic theology and practical theology, and where those really intersect, which for me means most of the time teaching courses in intercultural theology and also in religious studies. Drew and Daniel, would each of you now in turn say just a word of introduction about yourselves and your own research, separate from What Does Theology Do?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Daniel Lanzinger. I am a postdoc researcher at the Catholic Theological Faculty. I work in the field of New Testament studies, and in particular, I'm currently working on a project on divine providence in the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles.
And I'm Drew Davis, and I'm also working in New Testament studies in Bonn. And my research right now is I'm also on a postdoc, working on a postdoc like Daniel. And I'm working specifically on the question of the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and specifically in light of each of their use of the Old Testament.
Great, thank you. So what I'd like to do now is take 3 or 4 minutes myself to introduce the What Does Theology Do project on the whole, and then I'll turn specifically to What Does Theology Do to, and for that, I have a few questions prepared specifically for Drew and for Daniel, and so then we'll have a kind of conversation together. The idea of What Does Theology Do as a whole, the whole project, it's a series of symposia and books which are themselves built around the question, what does theology do? And the idea is to look at theology itself as a set of social discourses and a set of social practices. So even though I am a theologian, to the extent that I can step outside of my work as a theologian and look at doing theology as itself a historically contingent and historically produced set of discourses and practices, as I said. And then to see how these discourses and practices also have formed over time and how they vary across contexts and among different institutional contexts, not just cultural or geographical settings, but how the kinds of questions that we ask, the kinds of knowledge that we regard as worth producing depend and vary by institutional setting, ecclesiological setting, and political, cultural context as well. What Does Theology Do? 1 was held in Bonn in May 2019, and the first volume in the accompanying book series came out just about a month ago in September 2020, and that is with the Evangelische Verlagsanstalt, the press. And what we are doing, as I was saying, is we are really observing theology, not doing theology per se. So we are asking the question, what is theology doing? We're not asking the question, what is theology? Not trying to get at an essence of theology, but trying to describe the things that it does. The idea for the project, just a couple of quick comments on that. I would say that the project arose from some observations that I made mostly in the context of teaching over the past few years. And one of the ones that has been most significant for me is observing the observation that theologies, it seems, and I'm mostly speaking of theology in the plural when in my work, theologies, whatever else theologies might also be, it seems to me striking that theology helps communities solve problems. It seems to be a practical form of communicative action. So that's one point. The second point is the observation. I teach quite often in a program called the Master of Ecumenical Studies program. And so we have students from all over the world and a variety of Christian traditions. Again, continuing to wrestle with the reality that whereas in the year 1900, only about 20% of Christians lived in the global South, that nowadays well over 60% of all Christians in the world live in the global South. And yet the representation of their theologies, whether Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Pentecostal, or otherwise, the representation of those theologies remains very, very low in academic Western theology. It's a great sort of disproportionality there. But it's also difficult to figure out effective ways and systematic ways for doing theology, academic theology from the West, but in productive and mutually helpful cooperation with others based elsewhere. So the question is, okay, the question became for me, how to do this in a systematic way. And so then it kind of was what inspired me or motivated me to want to develop this series of symposia and books. Real quick, just on the programmatic level of the series, each symposia is being organized as a collection of speakers from a variety of places around the world. At What Does Theology Do? One, we had, I think, 8 different countries and 5 different continents represented. We are bringing together scholars from different career levels. So there are professors, postdoctoral scholars, and also doctoral and master students. And then we're bringing together a variety of disciplinary perspectives as well, so that we can get both internal theological perspectives on theological work and external non-theological perspectives on theological discourses. And then bringing these voices together, the fixed points for meaningful comparison are the main one is to organize ourselves around the classical theological subdisciplines. So What Does Theology Do? 1 was an inaugural event, but What Does Theology Do? 2 and onward are being focused on a particular discipline. So what does theology do? Exegesis. What does theology do? History of Christianity. What does theology do? Practical theology, systematic theology, and so on. And this second one, which Drew and Daniel and I are now organizing together, is being organized under the title, What Does Theology Do? 2, Exegeting Exegesis. And so now, with that introduction, I'd like to shift gears and turn the conversation toward that specifically now, and talk with Drew and Daniel about this symposium we are organizing for next year. I think it's a good way to think through the kinds of questions that the whole project is working on in the case of a particular example. How Bible and interpretation of the Bible are institutionally structured as an activity, as a form of practice in different locations. And we're going to talk about 5 different constellations of questions to be examined at What Does Theology Do? 2. The first set of questions seeks to demarcate various academic and social cultures of exegesis as not universal, but contextual, and then to set these alongside one another and to bring them into conversation with one another. So my first question is for Drew. Drew, could you say more about this set of questions, and what are these questions? Why are they important from your perspective as a New Testament scholar?
Yeah, of course. So I mean, the simple thing that we want to do with this set of questions, of the very first set of questions, is we're basically just proceeding from the observation that wherever exegesis takes place in different contexts, or I should say different institutions and different systems. And just as a completely straightforward example from my own experience, in Germany, for example, if you work in exegesis, you're probably in a public university doing either Catholic or Protestant theology, and that's pretty much the main options. But if you come or if you're in the U.S., where I grew up, then doing theology, exegesis in a theology department, you're definitely not in a public university, and you're most likely, if you're in a public university, you're definitely not doing theology, or at least that would be the sort of the talking points, so to speak. And so what we mostly want to do with our set of questions here is just get experts from throughout the world and have them tell us, well, how does it function in your country? How does it function in your part of the world? What kind of institutions are you at? Are they universities? Are they theological institutions? And then, of course, the next question that follows from that is, what kind of confessions are involved? To what extent does Eastern Orthodoxy play a role? Is the context largely Catholic or something else? So that's sort of some of the main things. But that would kind of the thing that guides my interest the most with this is to see to what extent that it influences the type of questions that are asked, the type of exegetical questions that are asked of the texts of the Bible, and to what extent that has an effect on how people read and interpret, even at academic level, how they reinterpret the Bible. Mm-hmm. From personal experience, as I first came to Germany, for example, I found it very interesting that at least in the Protestant department, there was a major focus on the Gospels and Paul. And it's kind of traditionally Protestant in that way. But what I was used to was also giving sort of equal weight to all of the other letters of the New Testament, for example. So that's just one small example from my own experience. But of course, the goal is to get quite a bit broader insights. That's sort of what's driving my interest on this first set of questions.
Cool. Now, so Daniel, my next question is for you. The second constellation of issues that we've been talking about seems very elementary, namely, what is a Bible and how, why, when, by whom is it read? But appearances can also be deceiving. So can you unpack these questions for us a little bit? And in what ways is there more at stake here than it might initially seem?
Yeah, of course. It seems very elementary that, we all know what is a Bible, but it actually isn't so elementary. We can start with the problem that there is no agreement between the denominations on what exactly is part of the Bible. For example, the Catholics have 2 books of Maccabees. Orthodox Christians have 4 books of Maccabees in the canon, and Protestants don't have them at all. So this is the problem of the canon. Then, as Drew has already mentioned, we have in Bonn here, we have a Protestant faculty and we have a Catholic faculty. Both of them have chairs for biblical exegesis, Old Testament and New Testament. So this evokes the question, are they doing the same or are they doing something different? So, one key question to address for our conference will be, is there something like a Catholic exegesis, a Protestant exegesis, an Orthodox exegesis? If yes, what are the key differences? Mm-hmm. Or finally, we can also ask if we do exegesis as an academic discipline, we treat the Bible as a historical source, like any other historical source. So another point to discuss might be, is it actually important whether the Bible is something like a sacred text or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you used this word, but it's a word that occurs to me. Those are some interesting, that's the boring academic version, but very provocative questions too. And I'm really excited as a non-exegete to sort of be a fly on the wall there to those conversations next July. Let's stick with you, Daniel, and move on to the third area of focus now, and that is the diversity of methods that characterize exegetical work. So you recently wrote to Drew and to me that there is a wide range of methods in exegesis, and you observed that the classical canon of historical critical methods is nowadays flanked by a lot of engaged approaches, such as feminist, post-colonial, queer, or ecological hermeneutics. And then here comes the point of constructive provocation. You summarize by saying, the overall impression, however, is that these approaches rather coexist than really cooperate. So I'd really like to hear you say more about that. What could a mixed methods conversation look like, and what difference might that make for exegetical work?
Yeah, maybe let me shortly explain why I wrote this rather coexist and cooperate sentence. I regularly go to international conferences like the SBL meeting, which is one of the biggest conferences in our field. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I was there confronted with the fact that there is a lot of panels on topics that I was totally unfamiliar with, like, for example, post-colonial exegesis. This seems to be an international trend in exegesis, but it's not very significant in our German context. So this made me aware of the fact that our historical critical methods, which for me seem to be the methods and quite obvious that this is the way how to do exegesis, it is actually a European invention, and in some parts it's even a German invention. But one point of our conference will be just to broaden the horizon and to become aware of this fact that there is something beyond, and there are more methods in exegesis than just our Western, let's call them Western methods. Mm-hmm. And yeah, one point of the conference will be just to get aware of this and to start a meta-reflection of what to do about that. Are our methods, are they the one and only thing that are fitting for all cultures, or is this not the case? And if this is not the case, we should talk about it.
Yeah. That's an enormous challenge, but I think enormously important also. So for those who are listening or watching, you can see we are not being shy to, perhaps we're being fools. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. But in any case, thank you, Daniel. Fourth topic, and for this we're going to go back to Drew. The term transfer has become important, prominent, popular in a growing number of fields of scientific research. As scientists, educators, but also civil and political leaders mutually recognize the importance of producing good, reliable knowledge that is also understandable and usable. So transfer between science and society. And then there's theology. So Drew, you've articulated a number of questions or curiosities and concerns about what kinds of transfer exegetical work generates. And, this joking manner that I have, of course, doesn't apply specifically or uniquely to exegesis. But I think, when I meet other postdocs or people around the university, I say what I do because that's what happens. And then they say, oh, what is that about? Well, it's almost like, in a very polite way, they're asking, why do you do that? So can you say something about this idea of transfer and exegetical work, and unpack that a bit, how that's going to be unpacked at the conference?
Yeah. I mean, you kind of already said sort of the central aspect, and that's that we're all sort of concerned now, or it's becoming an increasing concern. Academics say, well, how do we communicate what we're doing in a way that's clear and useful and shows why it's important that we're doing this? But I think for religion or theology or Bible, it's one of my colleagues recently was telling me, and he kind of convinced me of this, that I think there's a particular hurdle faced with religion because there's a lot at stake I mean, if you go to Wikipedia on some certain religion, you may find some misleading information. There's a lot at stake for people's own faith or people's own hostility towards faith, perhaps, and just simply prejudice or ignorance of other groups. And so I think we do face some particular challenges in this area, but it's not just between. I'm going to come to the kind of the point about sort of exegesis and society and how they go together, but there's different levels that they sort of interest me in this regard, because it's already even within the university. I just say the university, thinking of my own context here, but in theology generally, of what does exegesis actually have to say to the other theological disciplines? What does it have to say to people doing pastoral or practical theology, and to systematic theologians, to church historians? And so that is the first thing we wanted there is one aspect that we would like to explore in this as well. What does exegesis actually have to say? And it actually brings together some of the aspects of what Daniel was talking about a moment ago, and that's kind of the methods that we use. Because if we're using purely historical methods, then it makes it a bit of a more challenge to convince systematic theologians that perhaps what we're doing has something directly to say. But that sort of depends on the different approaches. But that's just an example of one of the challenges. Another one, and it brings together also some of the methods that Daniel was talking about, and that is, how do exegetes teach their students? What is it that they want them to know, and what is it that they want them to do with the Bible? Are they going to become teachers in schools? Are the students going to become pastors? And what's the expectation? What do exegetes expect these students to do when they go out into the world? And what are the knock-on effects of how the Bible is taught, and how others will then teach the Bible in society? And then finally, the third thing is back to kind of where we started, and that is, in what ways, in various contexts, are exegetical results or knowledge communicated to the public? And that could take different forms or different questions of what sort of material is available, what sort of books are available, what's the quality of that material. And then when exegesis does enter public discourse, which may or may not happen very often depending on the context, to what extent do scholars or exegetes see themselves responsible for speaking to those situations and offering their insight? So those are sort of the guiding questions that I have in mind for this section of the conference.
Great. Well, thank you to you both. I mean, this second round of what does theology do, and all the subsequent rounds really depends on experts. And I'm really, really excited to continue to work together with you guys in the planning and coordination of this. I mentioned that there were 5 areas, but I've only addressed 4 of them. And that's because the 5th one isn't really a topic so much as an invitation to reflection. And it's going to be a panel at the conference on the future of exegesis, but specifically for doctoral students who are people who are themselves young scholars finishing up dissertations, and who thus will be sort of contributing members to the next generation of professor exegetes, or placed otherwise in church, society, university. But so we want to place sort of the future question to these scholars. It's not an ought question about what exegesis ought to do in the future, but we want to get their insights into what exegesis might do, what it could do in the future. It's not an ought question of what it should do. It's not an is question of what definitely will it do, but a question about its potential. And I'm really looking forward to that as well, because and one of the things that's important to me about this whole project is to listen to these younger scholars who have ability to take risks, who are full of kind of creative ideas, and who are willing to kind of try something out. So that's the 5th and final topic to be addressed at the conference next July. Information about this event will be posted to our faculty websites and social media presences at the start of 2021. And we look forward to telling you, our listeners, about this exciting symposium and the list of speakers that we're lining up to present. We will have to make a determination eventually about whether it takes place completely online or whether we can offer a hybrid model. But one way or the other, we are looking forward to that. And thank you to all of you who have listened. And we welcome any questions or feedback by email, which you can find on our websites as well. Thanks, and that's all.
Bye.
Bye.